We're going to finish up these notes today on period 7. So I think we were together the last time and got through this slide, and I feel like we got through a little bit of this slide. I actually changed that picture up there. I don't know if you noticed, but I was talking to you about my friend Carl. That's him on the right. His daughter was very closely connected to both the Executive Order 9906 and Korematsu versus the United States, which is number 11 down there. Her name, so my friend's name is Carl, and his friend's name is Karen. And her name is Karen Korematsu, and her father was involved in the United States Supreme Court case that went in front of the Supreme Court that said the Executive Order 9906 was against civil liberties, and it should not be allowed. The Supreme Court actually upheld the case, and they said it was deemed a military necessity. I do want to let you know that pretty much the entire West Coast was deemed a military necessity. So if you were at all of Japanese heritage and you lived on the West Coast, really wherever, you were probably sent to a relocation camp. I hope you listened to the podcast on Weenie Royale. I am looking at doing an in-depth paper for my own personal gain. We had a relocation camp actually here in North Dakota at Fort Lincoln. There were some Italians and Germans there. It was primarily Japanese heritage, but here even in North Dakota, they would be I'm not going to call them prisoners, but they were interned. They were people who were relocated for the sake of national security. We have the Congress on Racial Equality. This is started at this time, but I'm not even going to touch on it because we're going to get into that a lot. It's called CORE as we get into period 8. I will talk about the Zoot Suit riots. This is one thing I want you to know. There's a picture of it right over here. The Zoot Suit riots are, these are what are called Zoot Suits. And if you look at these men, they're kind of like these, I wouldn't call them seersucker, but these types, this kind of a suit that was really closely related. Like if you were a Mexican American, you would wear a zoot suit. Well, part of the issue is that most of the Mexican Americans who were living in the United States at that time happened to be usually in the area of Florida, in New York, or in California. And what we see was happening, especially out in California, is that these young Latinos, young Latin Americans, and maybe they were still Mexican Americans, maybe they had not yet got any citizenship rights, but they were not part of the war effort. And we see a lot of riots breaking out between, especially sailors coming back from the Pacific into California, and these young Latinos. And it was over race. It was over the perceived kind of judgment, if you will. It was maybe some hurt feelings that I'm fighting for America, and you're back home living it up, dancing, going out with dates with the girls. And this was it was a really tense time in America when we're talking race relations. In fact, when we talk race relations, we have to talk about the Double V campaign and the segregated armed forces. The Double V campaign, think about what the Double V means. If you have a Double V, we're talking about a win, right? But in the Double V campaign, what we see are Black Americans are realizing we have to have victory both abroad in Europe and in Asia in World War II, but we also have to have victory at home. We have to be able to make some real serious like civil wins and successes at home. And one of the ways it had to happen were by desegregating the armed forces. At this time, we have segregated armed forces. Usually, if you were a Black American, clearly, we have already talked about the Navajo Code Talkers. If you were a Black American, you would have been welcomed most times into the military, but you were probably given kind of like a menial job. Like it wasn't as, you probably weren't on the front lines. You might not have been sent into areas of combat, which seems like, hey, that's really great. But at this time, the perception was you have to step up and fight. And so if you've ever heard of the Red, what's it called? The Red Ball Express. The Red Ball Express was almost exclusively a regiment of black truck drivers who pretty much kept transportation going, but all they were able to do was to be the drivers to shuttle troops from one area to another. These are where the Black Americans are saying we have to have victory both at home and abroad. And at home, the victory has to come with some equality, some rights, that we're fighting for this war abroad for the same kind of self-determination and freedoms and humaneness that we should get at home. I'm going to move this up just a little bit. Asa Philip Randolph was, he was a black leader, a civil rights leader, and he is threatening to have a march on Washington. He threatens FDR that if you don't desegregate the military, the armed services, we're going to stage a march. And because of that, FDR issues the Executive Order 8802. It does not desegregate the armed forces, but it does give equal opportunity in defense jobs, which means now, because up until Executive Order 8802, Black Americans couldn't even get jobs in civil defense. They were like excluded from them. And so Executive Order, this was issued in, I want to say 44. Even earlier, 41. It prohibited racial discrimination in defense jobs. Not all jobs, but in defense jobs. We'll talk a little bit more about Fair Employment Practices Commission again as we get into period 8. Komatsu versus U.S., a very big Supreme Court piece of legislation that was upheld, and it said, yep, it was for military necessity. And that lady, Karen Komatsu's father, was Fred Komatsu, the guy who brought this against the United States government, and the United States government unfortunately won. This was one case that we've looked back as a government, and we've said that probably wasn't right. Like, it should not have happened that way. We've apologized. We've made some reparations, but it's an important part of our history to know what was happening in World War II. All right, so there over on the right, you see the big three. Right in the middle is FDR. I'm not sure if you're aware, but by this point, FDR is stricken with polio, and he is confined to a wheelchair. Right there, it looks like it's an actual chair, so they must have gotten him up and put him in a different chair. Typically, you will always see FDR sitting down. The public probably knew he had polio and could not use his legs, but it was very much the press kind of taking care of him and not showing him as a vulnerable leader. So the United States and its allies achieved military victory through allied cooperation, technological and scientific advances, and contributions of servicemen and women in campaigns such as the Pacific Island hopping and the D-Day invasion. The use of the atomic bombs was hastened to end the war and sparked debates about the morality of using atomic weapons. So the Manhattan Project was a project that was started, it was probably started even before 1942, but it was started to build an atomic bomb, to build the A-bomb. And it first started in Chicago, and then it moved to an area in Tennessee called Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Eventually, they started testing the bombs out in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and so kind of in the middle of the desert. And the Manhattan Project was really, really a hush-hush project. In fact, it was Albert Einstein who, he didn't work on the Manhattan Project, but he realized that you could split nuclear fission, you could split atoms, and that would create this. And it was his idea, and he was a Jew, and he was able to escape and come to America before the Holocaust began. And he presented this idea. And then people like Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer, really kind of led it. So we're developing the atomic bombs, and we will see that they are going to be used. The Tehran conference, Tehran was in Iran, and the big three, so Stalin, FDR, and Churchill are there on the right. They met in Iran to basically talk about how the war was going. By 43, things are starting to look a little bit better for the Allies, but they're not great. I got to tell you, in 1939 and 40 and 41 and 42, and even into about the end of 43, at least the middle of 43, the Allies were getting kicked. Like, they were getting kicked real hard, and the Axis powers looked like they could probably dominate. It's no small miracle that at this time is when we are also dividing our forces. So the island hopping campaign was this very strategic way of moving around from island to island in the Pacific in order to get, as an offensive, to get closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. That was always the goal. In the back of our minds, not a lot of people know about the Manhattan Project by this time, but in the back of our minds, we know we have to get close enough to be able to leave from a ship in order to fly the plane that would drop the bomb. So we realize how important it is to take these islands. The Philippines is one of the most important, and as we get closer and closer to Japan, if you've ever heard of Iwo Jima, it's getting tougher and tougher to take these islands. The Japanese are really, really digging in. Finally, if we go back to Europe now, D-Day happens. This is a date I would like you to know. Along with December 7th, 1941, I'd like you to know June 6th, 1944. It is D-Day, that picture down there in the bottom right. This is when the Allied forces, 3 American beachheads, 1 Canadian, and 2 British, partly 1 Canadian, are taking these beachheads on the coast of France. It's on my bucket list one day. I lived in Europe for 3 years, and I never got that far north into Normandy. It's a really kind of a hallowed ground, and this is where we see the tide truly starting to turn for the Allies after D-Day, June 6, 1944. It's about this time that the Bretton Woods Conference is happening. Bretton Woods is kind of in the middle of Europe, and the big three are meeting again as to say, how do we repair and rebuild Europe? By 1945, they're having a conference in Yalta. Yalta is in the Crimea, which, if you know where the Crimea is, think about where Russia is, think about where Greece is in the Black Sea. The Crimea is like this little kind of island, almost jut out, and they meet there, the big three meets there to discuss the end of war, how they're going to make peace. Now, this is in 1945, before Hitler has committed suicide, before they have the Axis power has given up and surrendered. So we already know that the war is going to be won by the Allies in early 1945, and they're meeting as to discuss, okay, how do we handle this best? Because we do realize after the Treaty of Versailles, that was not handled well. We don't want another mess like that. What we should have probably realized is the way the man was behaving on the left. Joseph Stalin was he was getting mostly really paranoid. The reason why it happened in Yalta, and I do have to say that President President Roosevelt's health at this time is really deteriorating, so he had to go all the way to the Crimea for this conference, and Stalin only went as far as basically out his back door of Russia because Stalin wouldn't leave home. He was becoming extremely paranoid. He felt everybody, like there was a constant conspiracy to kill him, to take him out. So we know that the Yalta Conference was really, really difficult on President Roosevelt. What you really should know is that Churchill, the man on the right, the Prime Minister of Britain, couldn't stand Stalin by this time. And so the relationship is between the big three, these three major allied countries, is really starting to disintegrate. I could go on and on and on and on about this, but I'm not going to. If you ever want to stop in and chat with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But we see the end of the war is coming, even though it hasn't officially been declared. Eventually, we have the Nuremberg trials, which we see the horrors of the Holocaust, and we bring those who are guilty forth into trial. We are going through an entire actual trial process to try those who have been committed of atrocities, of these horrible crimes against humanity. You can't see exactly all of this, but I have Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We dropped the bombs first on Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. It doesn't actually get the Japanese to surrender, so then we drop the next bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later, August 9th, 1945. That is enough to end the war with Japan. In the meantime, the Germans have already surrendered. Hitler died by suicide. The Germans surrender in May. It's called VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. In May of 1945, Japan doesn't do it until August of 1945. So the war is over. Keep in mind these three men. Keep that in mind. I should say something about this man. His health was declining. I mentioned that. Roosevelt dies. Roosevelt actually dies even before Hitler dies by suicide in April of 1945. So lots of things, lots of politicalness is going to be changing the face of both how World War II is ending and how the Cold War is going to begin. And so in all honesty, I'm not going to get into this a lot. The war-ravaged conditions of Asia and Europe and the dominant U.S. role in the Allied victory and post-war peace settlements allowed the U.S. to emerge from the war as the most powerful nation on earth. Really, those last few words are probably what you need to take from this. Between what had happened at the late 1800s, when we get into the Spanish-American War, and then into the end of World War II, the United States was able to emerge truly as the most powerful nation. We start the United Nations, the Potsdam Conference this is in 45. We already know that bombs are going to drop. Don't worry about any of that. In fact, we really don't even need to worry about the World Bank or the IMF, because these are all things that we're going to be talking about as we go into period 8. So that's it. We are done. And until we meet again, talk to you later. Bye.